welcome to the big episode number 51, Gar Borras. Today we're going to be talking about a really kind of, I think, it's cool we're doing this because I think it's really a forgotten show. And what I'm talking about is Casey Kasem's America's Top 10. Now, I sent you a couple of the episodes I found up on YouTube. So let's get into it, Gar. What do you remember from that show?
Well, just to put it in context, because people from my generation would understand this better than younger generations.
Sure.
It was the predecessor to MTV.
Yeah. In fact,
it was basically a very
early edition
commercial bubblegum version of it. It was very squeaky clean
Sure.
and middle America
Yeah.
worthy. MTV, by the time that came about, the ability to be able to market things that weren't squeaky clean
I don't know,
became more acceptable during the MTV time. But during the Americans Top 10 time period, this is pre-cable and all that stuff, and so a show like that, because it's pre-cable and it was shown on regular network TV, it had to be squeaky clean.
Sure, and it's funny you said that about kind of being the precursor to MTV. Very much it was, but I say that because when I announced we were going to do this today on the Facebook page this morning, I actually, in the description for today's show, I put something to that effect that America's Top 10 predates even MTV. And let's think about that for a little bit, because like you're saying, because it was on TV, it had to be squeaky clean. But people, what's really interesting when you break America's Top 10 down is who was Casey Kasem? Well, for years people knew Casey Kasem as a radio disc jockey. He had this show called America's Top 40. So this is America's Top 10. Very much, it's a half an hour show. So there's no way in hell they could have a list of going down a list of 40 songs just in a 30-minute period of time. So they had to go from top 40 to top 10. So that's the first thing people got to realize. This was kind of based off his radio show, but they made it the top 10 instead.
And basically that's what was happening was that the top 10 was a condensed
version of the radio.
40.
Yeah, and again, it's interesting because we're talking about this now all these years later. The show has been off for several years. Casey Kasem, I think, passed away. I was reading 2014, and so he's long gone. And like I said, the way I came up to do with the idea to do today's episode, I happened to be online, and I came on my YouTube, and an old episode of this popped up, and I thought, that would be a great thing to do an episode on for so many reasons. We're going to get into all those reasons today, but one of the reasons is, like you're saying at the top of today's show, unless your age group of my age group or your age group, a lot of people tuning in, they might not even know who the hell Casey Kasem is. So for that reason alone, I felt it's time to kind of give some love to Casey Kasem and America's Top 10.
And back in the day, when he was, doing the radio show and just kind of, becoming part of TV and doing all of that stuff, he was every bit just as popular as what's his name, Dick Clark.
Oh, sure, and this is a time, when Gar and I grew up, like in the 60s, the 70s, and 80s, DJs, I mean, again, this predates the internet and the modern technology we're living in today. So radio was a big part of our lives. I mean, you mentioned, obviously Casey Kasem we're talking about, Rick Dees, Wolfman Jack, probably a little closer to, when you were a young man, Gar, but Jay Thomas, Shadow Stevens, all these guys we brought up before. DJs were they were huge personalities. These guys were getting, they were some of the best paid radio personalities of their time, and I...
go ahead.
I was just going to say, and so I think with Casey Kasem, he was popular enough at the time. His radio show was popular at the time, and again, it's interesting because this predates YouTube and the internet and all that, and so I think they were kind of thinking, okay, he's so popular on radio, I wonder if we could transition the radio show into a TV show, and they managed to do it.
And it's another snapshot
yes.
of a time period, because everything has changed.
Sure. Yes,
now see, back in the day when America's Top 10 was super popular, there wasn't as many entertainment there wasn't as broad of a range of entertainment that people had to be able to choose for their entertainment.
Sure.
It was much less complicated, and there was a lot less. You were either into sports, or you were into this, or you were into that. But nowadays, because there are so many, it's just become this outrageously diverse, slew of things to choose from for entertainment. I don't think that we will ever see music having that dominance and popularity like it used to have during the heyday of the top 10 and basically the heyday of
1980s
music.
Yeah.
And because of that change, that's the reason why a show like America's Top 10 was so popular, was because there was not all this other noise going on around, and there were literally legions of people that were really, really into music.
Yeah.
So much, really emotionally connected to their favorite artists. Literally emotionally connected to their favorite artists.
Yeah.
I had to repeat that because you really have to get your mind wrapped around that.
Sure.
The popularity of bands still has that element, but it's not like what it used to be. People used to literally be locked into, they would, that's all they would listen to, that they would dress like the artist, or their clothing would be influenced by that artist. You see what I mean?
Sure.
It was a lot more focused and a lot more of a microscope on music back then, because there was a lot less to choose from, so that made people just really loyal and locked into just loving music. It was more than just loving, that's my favorite song. No, people were becoming emotionally locked into these artists. It became part of their lives.
Yeah, and like we said, we need to really make the point, Gar, that, during the time, 60s, 70s, 80s when we grew up, the DJ was a very big part of people's lives. And so I remember, accidentally coming across this show, America's Top 10, for the very first time back in the day. And, Casey Kasem, that's what he looks like. That's the guy, that's the guy on the radio. Okay. And then you watch the show a few times, and the thing was, it's, he's got a real kind of friendly, happy-go-lucky kind of personality, and so it wasn't too controversial. It was kind of fun to watch. This guy's always happy. And then the thing of it was, again, it predates MTV, and you tune into a show and they wouldn't even play the whole music video because it's a 30-minute show, and so they play like a 5-second snippet of each video, and then between that he would talk about each of his songs and kind of give a little trivia. And what I loved about it, it really was a snapshot. And I think like when we created the Time Machine, there's no way these people could have known who created that show that, hey, when the show's long off air, I mean, like, it started popping up on YouTube, like I said, and I started checking out some of the old episodes, and immediately I thought, very much like our Time Machine, Gar, America's Top 10 is probably one of the very first, what I would say, visual, time machine, virtual. You go back and you watch an episode, and you're like, it really tells you what was going on in the world at the time, who the popular artists were, what were the popular songs, and it had less to do with. Who was selling. Well, it had a lot to do with who was selling the most records, but it was less about a popularity contest and more about just who was on the charts.
That is a huge, huge point.
Yeah.
About the show, because I highly recommend people from my generation and your generation to go back and watch those episodes, because basically what will happen is you will wind up, because of what you just explained, you will go down memory lane.
And it kind of,
he's going to wind up Casey Kasem's going to wind up mentioning these things, that are little tidbits about the time period, and a little bit, backstories about the song and backstories about the artist and stuff like that. And what, viewing it now, evokes memories.
Sure,
basically you're watching it and they go,
I remember that.
You're remembering that time period and special moments for you that you would never have brought it back, those memories, had you not gone back and watched these videos, because it literally does spark those memories.
I mean, I guess that what I'm trying to say is like very much a visual, a time machine, a visual landscape of what was going on in our lives at that time. And interestingly enough, even like once MTV hit the airwaves, eventually they break it down. They'd have these different types of genres. Okay, tune in Saturday night for Headbangers Ball. Before that, at 10 p.m. we're going to have Yo MTV Raps and stuff like that. They would break it down into genres. The interesting thing about America's Top 10, I can speak for myself, but I think this is very much true probably of yourself and other people who tune into the show. It didn't really matter if I was a metal fan. I would tune into the show every week. And in fact, one of the episodes I sent you, I don't know if you saw this episode, but in this one episode, Casey Kasem made a remark, amazingly this week, we happen to have 3 heavy metal bands on the countdown. Poison, Guns N' Roses, and Def Leppard. So that was pretty amazing, like, as a fan of hard rock and metal. 3 metal bands in 1 week were on, in the top 10. That's not something you see too often these days,
It's a kind of really, because, the top 10 was on during that time period. It really kind of documents the spike that occurred in the popularity of the hair bands, because now they wound up infiltrating the top 10. Which really, was not bubble gum, but they wound up, having to include them because it was all part of what the top 10 was about, and they could, you can't exclude a genre just because you don't like it. Of them. And because at that time when the spike occurred, and it went from being kind of obscure to being very popular,
very mainstream,
so popular that it's showing up on the billboards and everything like that. It really is a documentation of that actual spike that occurred when hair band metal was in its rebellious stage, which was in its very beginning.
Yeah, yeah.
Which that we've touched on this many times on the Time Machine. The ultimate ingredient in the spike of popularity of music had a lot to do with the rebellion of the young generation.
Sure.
And it was a critical element that whenever you saw a spike that occurred in the popularity of music, that was an element also that was part of the spike that actually occurred.
Yeah.
And that's when you see it on the top 10, because it really was not a friendly to that element, but yet they still had to put it on there because they broke that barrier.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, too, the thing with the radio stations, very much like the Top 10 show we're talking about, is back in the day, you could put on like a FM rock radio station, and they might play something by Elvis Presley, might play something by, the Eagles or Rolling Stones. You get a little bit of everything, and that's the cool thing about the show, because as much as I loved like tuning in and saying, oh, wow, Poison and Guns N' Roses, and Def Leppard all on the countdown this week. You'd also see like Taylor Dane, who was a new artist at the time, premiered on the Billboard Top 10 chart, and all these Eddie Money, and so you'd have these different types of artists, and they like you said back in the day, they weren't really censoring like, oh well, this isn't we're not going to include any hard rock acts. It was whatever was on the Billboard Top 10 that would be what would be discussed for that week.
Well, you touched on Elvis. That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about the spike of popularity happening and having to have rebellion as one of those elements of that spike. Elvis Presley, in the very, very beginning of his career, where his popularity was spiking, what was happening? Rebellion.
Yeah.
He was the poster child in the early 50s of rebellion because they wouldn't show his dance movements below the waist.
Yeah.
It was too much for squeaky clean America. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It was too much. And so there you go. That's a classic example of the spike in popularity of a musical act, and the critical element of that spike is the rebellion part of it. And I just have a feeling that that I don't know how the future is going to be, but whatever becomes really popular with the younger generation is also going to have that element as part of it.
Yeah, and like we said, this really predates MTV, and there's no way you can say that this show did not influence MTV. The biggest difference, I'd say, between this was a 30-minute show, so you were limited to what you got, whereas once MTV hits, MTV is 24 hours, 7 days a week. And MTV's got, at one point, they get to the point where they have a huge catalog of music videos to play every day, all night long, every day. And that was the biggest difference is, it went from, just seeing you might have seen a snippet of a Poison video on America's Top 10, but then they might play, but you get to go to MTV now and they play the entire video.
Well, but then also that element was also part of network TV at the same time.
Yeah.
Because, Casey Kasem, his first spike in popularity was on a dance show called Shebang.
Oh, wow.
And, at that time, those dance shows were really super popular. Now, we did the Dick Clark episode because that was the most popular. But Dick Clark's American Bandstand was not the only show of that nature that was on TV. There was a bunch of them.
Wow.
There was Hullabaloo. There was Shebang. There was a bunch of them, and I remember because I was a kid at that time, and the popular acts were all those 1960s acts, and so you would watch these shows. I would watch these shows, and they were super popular, and you got to hear your favorite songs from beginning to end, and it was kind of like watching a music video because you were watching people dancing. But that was the super popularity soup that gave birth to MTV. It wasn't one thing. It was the whole soup that happened, and it was super popular way back in the 60s when I was a kid, and all of that really was the precursor to MTV. But his show Shebang, a lot of people don't know what Shebang means.
I got to look that up. Wow.
I do.
Yeah.
Because, during that same time, I remember a lot of people would use this as a slang term back in those days. When you were talking about something in its entirety.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Say, oh my gosh, instead of bringing just this or bringing back just that, we brought the whole shebang.
Yeah. Wow.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
We brought everything.
See that? Yeah.
No, this show doesn't include this, or this show doesn't include. It includes the whole shebang. So shebang means like in the entirety.
Yeah, things started to change in the 1970s, Gar, as far as that, because, like I said, when we were growing up, DJs were a very big part of people's lives, and for the most part, we heard our music on the radio. I've heard famous musicians talk over years about the fact that, back in the 70s, it didn't really matter what we looked like. We didn't have to worry about that. But all of a sudden, when the record companies start making you film these music videos, all of a sudden, you got to worry about what you look like and what you're going to wear. And it's just another aspect of something that we didn't previously have to be concerned about.
The 1970s was that pivotal decade where that had occurred, because previous to that, nobody really cared that much what the
lead singer looked like,
entertainers looked like, other than the singer or the star or whatever, who was ever considered the star of that band. That was really the spotlight during that time period. But then the 80s became they basically, the 80s took the whole Beatles and boy band thing, because that became super marketable, way back in the 1960s. But the 80s took that whole,
image,
guy band thing, and just did it on steroids.
Yeah, and
you know what I mean? Because during the 80s, there was still this phenomenon that doesn't exist as much today as it used to exist back then. The female element of the audience, would always have the crush on this guy or that guy, and I remember, I used to scoff at girls back in those days because, when they would talk about baseball, all they would talk about was their favorite baseball player, and then if you asked them why they were your favorite baseball player, is because he was so cute.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? that was the way that the female element was very prevalent, back in those days, and girls gravitated towards the hairband guys. It was like the hairband guys were like a magnet.
Oh, sure.
A literal magnet. And so the 80s turned that whole thing into like freaking steroids.
Yeah,
But then, because of that, by the end of the 80s, because that whole genre lasted like so long, it was like an anomaly because it lasted so long that by the time it reached its end, it was done.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was dead, and it was to never be resurrected again the way that it was at that time.
Oh, sure. And Gar, just to drive the point home, because we've discussed this in some of our past episodes, you made a point in one of the past episodes about, look at the Beatles, how clean cut they once were. But talking a little bit more about that rebellion, that's why eventually they got to a point where they all grew their hair long, they all grew beards and stuff. They're like, okay, you think you know what the Beatles are? We're gonna change your image of what we really are.
And then that element, because they did that, ingratiated every hippie known to mankind.
Yeah.
Because at that time, when the Beatles were doing that, they were actually influencing
everyone.
Hippie attire.
Sure.
When the Beatles made that transition, people don't think of it in that context. But when the Beatles made that transition in their career away from the suit and tie and the squeaky clean and all that stuff, and started, introducing the attire of the hippie, the popularity of dressing like that exploded, and it had everything to do with the Beatles.
Yeah, let me ask you, Gar, now, just to kind of drive the point home even further. Now, like when you bring up something like tie-dye, what's the band you immediately kind of think of?
Grateful Dead.
Exactly. And see there, you go to Grateful Dead and all their t-shirts that have tie-dye and stuff. They're the ones that kind of started that. And anytime anybody thinks of tie-dye, Grateful Dead is the first thing they think of.
Back in the 60s, I don't know how, because there was no internet.
Yeah.
And she must have learned how to do it from a magazine.
Yeah.
Because that was the source for information. But I remember it was either my mom or my sister. They had learned how to make tie-dye.
Wow.
And so I have memories of my sister and I during that time period of our life making tie-dye shirts.
How funny.
I had made my own tie-dye tank top.
Wow. I never did that myself, but I can tell you, just recently having walked through a Michael's art supply store, I seen that they have a tie-dye set that you can buy these t-shirts, and they have a tie-dye paint set where you just kind of spray the stuff on the t-shirt and kind of go crazy. It looked like it would be fun. But the other interesting thing about Casey Kasem America's Top 10, like we said, is the show aired, from what I was able to find out, for about 12 years, from 1980 to 1992. It didn't really say why the show went off the air, but my guess would be because at that point MTV had been huge. But right around, interestingly enough, as America's Top 10 comes to an end, that's around the same time that MTV would stay for a few more years, but I think by 1995 MTV was off the air.
Well, it was just a natural progression, because I think when I was watching episodes of America's Top 10 that you sent me, I noticed that they were including an entire video clip a la MTV, as part of an element of
the show.
The top 10.
Yeah.
And they would highlight, instead of just doing videos, what America, they were trying to kind of infuse the MT element into the top, America's top 10, and trying to adapt to the phenomenon of MTV, but it wasn't enough. MTV's popularity was literally a juggernaut.
Took over
at that time.
Yeah.
When it got introduced to TV, the hunger from the young audiences was insatiable at that time, and the popularity of MTV just shot up like a rocket ship. It didn't take there was no slow build to that.
Yeah.
It immediately took off like a rocket ship.
Oh, sure.
And America's Top 10 just could not compete with that.
Yeah, and I think too, but if you really think about it, is America's Top 10 had Casey Kasem, and he was one of those guys, let's be honest, as popular as he was back in the day, people either loved him or hated him. What I mean by that is you look back now, that guy, he was a nerd. He doesn't look all that cool. I mean, back in the day, he was cool, but you have people that, look at him in his goofy looking sweaters. But that's what was popular back when he was coming up. But see, and you compare that to like MTV. They had a whole slew, a whole bunch of different hosts and VJs.
Rebellion.
And like Casey Kasem, like you'd never see Casey Kasem have an episode where he spiked his hair. He just wasn't made for TV back in the day,
See, that's what I'm talking about. It was that element of rebellion, and I just see it. I have no idea where it's going to happen, but
you'll know when you see it.
The younger crowd, they're going to wind up having something that's going to wind up being super popular with them, and it's gonna have that element of rebellion.
Yeah.
And which means that Main Street
media,
or mainstream, the mainstream element of society is always going to scoff at it, just like it has always through the years. Just like mainstream scoffed at Elvis Presley during his time, and scoffed at everybody else that was doing something rebellious. You have your Jim Morrison of the Doors. That is a poster child for rebellion.
Oh, sure.
You know what I mean? And it just goes, the list goes on and on of all of these rebellious people.
Yeah, and I mean, you even take it, maybe one of the more recent examples is Axl Rose, like refusing to attend, Guns N' Roses being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Some other guys show up, but he was purely against it, and he put out a press statement, made a big, huge deal about it, but that was his thing,
Well, without rebellion, you don't have progress.
Sure.
And you don't have change. You know what I mean? It's the element of the actual going against the grain where new things are discovered.
Yeah, and then the other thing in watching these episodes that really kind of touched me was, Casey Kasem in these episodes came across as like a real historian of rock and roll music. I mean, they started breaking it into the show with like little facts and rock and roll trivia. Like there was one episode where he said something about somebody sent in a trivia question, which was something to the effect of, Can you name the musician, a solo artist who's had like 2 solo hits in the top 10 in the same week or something like that? And I think it was Paul McCartney. He said, "Oh yeah, going back to 1970 whatever." Paul McCartney had a hit song with his wife Linda McCartney with Wings and some other solo song. And
I listened to the song and it wasn't catchy at all.
Yeah. But see again, I mean.
But they're using it in the spotlight because it was from Paul McCartney, and come on, you can't get bigger than that, even at that time period. period. I mean, Paul McCartney's, popularity was just, astronomical. So, of course, it gave him the edge over them considering using someone else for that same spotlight. But that spotlight is what I was talking about, was that element that they were using to try to use the, to give the top 10 an MTV element.
In fact,
you see what I mean?
In fact, they had a segment. I didn't see any of the episodes that we were watching, but they had a segment of a show that they created called a song that should have been a hit or something, where it was a song that like hit number 11 or maybe lower on the chart, but it's a song that just kind of missed being in the top 10. It charted like at number 11 on the Billboard Chart or number 12 or something like that, which still pretty good, but it's not in the top 10. They're like, don't know why that that song never charted higher. Or he'd do stuff like also eventually he'd say, okay, well, now after looking at the top, the top 10 Billboard Chart, let's look at what was the top 10 like country chart for the week, or the top 10 R&B chart, and they'd kind of take it in different directions like that as well.
That's true, and that gave the show a very broad, the choice for them to do that, it gave that show the ability to not alienate.
Yeah, and they did it in such such an innocent way. I mean, I don't even think they thought of stuff like that. I mean, like I said, I was so excited watching the one episode. Oh wow, Poison, Guns N' Roses in the same episode, Def Leppard, all in the top 10. And I didn't mind, playing a Tom Petty song. I remember watching that show. That was probably how I first was exposed to to Tom Petty. Seeing that song, "Don't Come Around Here No More," a video for that, and kind of, hey, that's that's not hard rock and roll, but that's cool. If it had not been for that show, I might not have been a fan of what Tom Petty did.
Well, it's like all of these elements that if you go back and you watch them, episodes on MTV, it's those elements that spark those going down memory lane memories.
Yeah.
And that's what happened to me when I started rewatching these episodes that you sent me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm watching it, and immediately I'm going down memory lane. I'm remembering this and I'm remembering that, and it's just a natural thing that happens if you rewatch these episodes of this show.
And I'm gonna post some of these, of course, on the Facebook page when we post our episode next week that we're doing today. But the thing is, Gar, what was cool about rewatching these episodes is, again, we're talking about something that was a 30-minute TV show, but watching the YouTube versions, they take the commercials out, and you're done watching the episode maybe within 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the episode. And it really is a great time capsule. And what made it so fun, you watch like old episodes of things, and you don't necessarily know, this is from the week of whatever. But that was the whole point of a show. And so it would say, like, for the week of March 2nd, 1980. And so you'd watch a show. Oh, wow. Even like as we were watching it years later, you're like, oh, wow, so that's what was popular in 1980 at that time, the week of March 2nd or whatever it was. And it's like, it really is a great visual time capsule.
It very much is. And you really put it in perspective about, if you go back and watch it, it's not they were half hour episodes, but they pull the commercials out, so it's dramatically reduced. So you're not going to be sitting there, spending half your day,
and I bring that up,
or wasting a whole bunch of your time, going back. But it's worth it just to, once he starts doing these trivia aspects of the show and doing these like different, they have like these different, elements of the show, little tidbits and stuff like that. It it's gonna happen to anyone that winds up rewatching these episodes. You're gonna wind up going down memory lane,
and then
and it's not a bad journey down memory lane. It's a good journey down memory lane.
And I urge people to go on YouTube and check these videos out, because it doesn't take you very long to watch them, and that's the fun thing, is because I know a lot of people don't have a huge attention span. You're lucky if we're lucky if we get people to tune in for one of our whole entire episodes. You know what I mean? After like the first maybe 20 minutes, they want to tune out or come back to it later. But that was what was fun. And then the other thing that I noticed, Gar, is from week to week the countdown would change, just because, like, for example, you might watch some of the episodes and say, okay, so like, you know, our number one song from last week has dropped off the charts. We have a new number one, or or something like that, or what was number 5 is dropped off, and we have a new number 5. But so from week to week, you never knew what you're gonna get. You get some of the same, but some songs would kind of just die after a while.
Well, then again, you just touched on another really big element of the show. Was people were. Okay, I should rephrase this. Music fans back then were so
more open.
The best way to describe it, so into whatever band they were into. It was very similar to how you see sports fans, where sports fans will be not only a fan of a particular team, but they will also be fans of a particular player. You see what I mean?
Sure.
And then they go out and buy that player's T-shirts. They're that much of a fan. Well, back in those days, music fans were huge in that same way. In being into their band. So what I'm getting at is people that would watch America's Top 10 would be watching it in anticipation to see if their favorite band or their favorite song breaks into the top 10. You see what I mean?
Sure.
That's part of the reason why people were watching the show, not just to watch it as a casual, this is fun. No, there were people that were watching the show because they were in such anticipation to see if their favorite band or their favorite song was breaking into that top 10.
And you'd have advertisers, they'd advertise new records coming out. I mean, records back in the day. You remember what a record was? You remember those 45s? That was a big deal on a show like America's Top 10. I mean, you would see a video or something on that show for the first time. You'd see what the number one song was, and you'd say, you know what? I want to go out and buy that single. I'm going to go buy the 45. And a lot of people would base their music shopping on what they saw on a show like that.
Another element of the show that really benefited the industry was that show was a element that generated sales for those artists that were being tossed around in the top 10 or close to the top 10. You see what I mean? It was, that show had an effect on record sales.
Oh, sure it did, and even to the point that the show, also influenced another thing on MTV. Was, see, the biggest difference between MTV and America's Top 10 was, besides America Top 10, it's just the top 10. You're just getting snippets of the music videos. But the other thing is, like, they created like Dial MTV. Now, the difference with Dial MTV would be, it kind of like be a top 10 video countdown, but it was what people were requesting, not necessarily what was on the Billboard Chart. So the other thing I think too, they based like Dial MTV off of a show like that, but that was based more on what people wanted here. They would call this number, 800 number, and they would request, and whatever got the most kind of votes, that is what made up the countdown. Now, the other thing with America's Top 10 is, I don't think outside of somebody working in the music industry, being a radio DJ, somebody at a record label, or a musician, a lot of people back then didn't have a clue what the Billboard Chart was. But once that show hit the airwaves, everybody had a much better understanding of what the Billboard Music Chart was.
Just the sheer popularity of the Billboard, spiked because of that. You know what I mean? That show endeared the Billboard to America.
In fact, from what I understand and doing a little bit of research I was able to do on America's Top 10, Casey Kasem's main kind of source, obviously, for the show was the weekly Billboard music magazine, and that's where they get a lot of their information. Again, like I said, you watch the show, Gar, and you just kind of confirmed this, that Casey Kasem very much would come across as a musical historian, a guy who knows all this great rock and roll trivia. Now, I'm sure very much like the show we put together, he was well rehearsed, he did his research before the show, but again, that's the impression that people have after watching the show. Oh, God, this guy, Casey Kasem, he's the perfect guy to host this show. He knows all this stuff about music.
He knows everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, everybody does that now.
No, but yeah.
That's an expert has a team that works for them to gather all that information for them and feed it to them.
Yeah, and I'm sure he did too, but I mean, he came across very much like you watched Jeopardy back in the day, and Alex Trebek just seemed like this guy that knew all these interesting facts. But again, somebody wrote his script, somebody researched these questions. He was just the guy kind of hosting the show, but he had that effect on people who would watch the show.
Yeah, but then also back in the 60s, people would watch TV shows and then they would see the star or that particular actor, and when a regular person would see an actor in public, the first thing that goes in through that person's mind is they don't think of that person as themselves. They think of that person as the character they portray. And everything that they think about that person is all based on the character that they portray, and none of it is based on the person themselves.
Yeah. A great example of that, no matter how many TV shows John Ritter had, he will always be thought of primarily as Jack Tripper.
Yes. You meet him at the store.
Hey, Jack.
Would you say John Ritter, or would you say Jack Tripper?
Hey, Jack.
50% of the time, that's what happens when the general public comes in contact with their favorite actor or actress, or you see what I mean?
Yeah.
At least half the time when they come in contact, instead of blurting out their real name, they will blurt out their character name.
Yeah, very, very much so. And here's a bit of trivia before we wrap up today's show, Gar. Besides being a renowned, world-famous DJ and the host of America's Top 10, do you know the other thing that Casey Kasem is remembered for?
Oh, of course.
Scooby-Doo?
Shag.
Yeah, Scooby-Doo. Yeah, Shaggy. Yeah.
And it's so funny because Shag and Scooby, the never outspoken premise about both of those characters is they were pot smokers, and they always had the munchies.
Yeah.
And it was never spoken, but
you just kind of knew
you
it.
were of the age that you knew what was going on and stuff like that, and you would see the connotations in that cartoon. There's no mistaking the connotations when you're watching. It was all done as connotations.
Just kind of understood,
But you would recognize those that points towards that, even though it was never spoken out loud.
Yeah, it was.
And it's funny because you got a guy like Casey Kasem that his entire career he's always been squeaky clean.
Yeah.
And now he's portraying a character that's a freaking pot-smoking freaking guy from the 70s. Because basically that's who Shag was some pot-smoking guy from the 70s.
Again, and I love the fact that this guy got to start on the radio. You know, he eventually got this countdown show on TV, but that's probably one of the things he's really remembered for is the voice of Shaggy. And I can't.
Can I tell you something?
Sure.
Okay, now a lot of people don't know this, but the name Shag. The reason why that name was given to that character
I'd love to hear
was the name was based on the most popular haircut of the hippie time period,
wow.
which was called the Shag
wow.
cut.
Wow. There's some real...
And a lot of people went to their hairstylist to get their hair cut in that style cut. And one famous musician that if you go back to the 60s you see his haircut at that time is wearing that Shag haircut. Mick Jagger in the Stones wore the Shag haircut. Back in the 1960s with cut.
Wow, that's and you know it's so funny that people, you know, they have these careers of like successful voiceovers, very much like what he did with Shaggy, and I love the fact that's one of the things he, you know, in fact Shaggy is the complete opposite. Casey Kasem was so clean cut, but Shaggy was unshaven and he had the shaggy hair, but I love that.
They always had the munchies.
Yeah.
Do you notice that? Anytime there was the element of food, they were ravenous.
Yeah, remember Scooby Snacks? Yeah.
You know, and it's just so funny to look back at that because unless you were really watching those cartoons,
you can miss that.
Know, back in those days, it's either forgotten or people watch it nowadays and it's lost in translation because those connotations are no longer, you know, relevant now. You know what I mean? So you watch it and you really don't put two and two together, but if you watched it during that time, you definitely put two and two together.
Yeah, you know, and another thing, like you said, Gar, that people get a reputation. People think they know certain things about certain celebrities. And for most of his life and career, Casey Kasem had a very clean image. He's never really part of any big controversy. But I do remember, like, one of the last things he did professionally on the radio. I don't know if he was being interviewed or if he was on the. I think it was when he was on the radio. He went off on somebody, had some major rant that just kind of went viral, and for like maybe the first.
Somebody recorded it.
Yeah, it's maybe for the first time in his life or career, he went a little crazy, and like you said, somebody recorded it. They released it to the press. I think you could even go online and find it if you do the search, but it just kind of became one of those things, and then. You know, he's died and he's passed on, and a lot of people forgot about that. But when I typed in like Casey Kasem to kind of look up some information for today's show, that's one of the things that came up. But again, it was only one time.
That is the best way to describe that particular instance.
Yeah.
Even though viral didn't exist back in those days.
That sure went viral.
If you said the word viral back then, you know, everyone would just look at you with the most quizzical look because nobody knew. You just never heard that word ever spoken back in those days.
Yeah.
But it is the best word to use to describe what happened in that instance, even though viral didn't exist. It literally went viral.
And I remember, like,
just not through the internet.
Yeah, I remember.
It went viral through the public.
through the press and people. I remember even
Yes.
Howard Stern on an episode of his radio show, like kind of dissecting the whole thing. Oh, Casey's not so clean and squeaky clean like people think. Kind of joking around about it.
Yeah, and the last thing that I would ever want to do is focus on.
Oh, I'm with you, Gar.
The dark.
I'm with you, Gar, but
and stuff like that. But the battle that went on between Casey Kasem's kids from his first marriage and his wife that he wound up marrying later.
Yeah.
That was like 23 years younger than him. That just was really dark and contentious.
Yeah.
A lot of people put it, at number one.
Yeah.
As far as
story.
Really nasty family battles.
Yeah.
After a famous person's death. I think it really goes down as number one, as the nastiest of them all.
Yeah, I remember hearing about it at the time. In fact, one of his daughters, Carrie Kasem, she had a radio career herself, and I think at the time she had a show with, of all people, Nikki Sixx, Sixth Sense or something. I think she was his co-host, and she would talk a lot about it at the time. In fact, I don't know too much more about, but I was reading something today in preparation for today's show that he's buried, of all places, in Norway. Didn't say why, but I mean, maybe he's originally from there. I don't know, but kind of interesting. A guy that made his, found fame in the United States is buried in Norway. But again, and I don't want to focus on the negative like you, but it is kind of part of the story. So we deserve to kind of touch on it just a bit, so. Because we want to kind of do our best to tell the whole story. But I tip my hat, too, to Casey Kasem, because he started out on the radio, and that's how most people knew him. He had the show on the radio, really predated all the MTV stuff. It kind of, I think, had a big part to do with the launch of MTV. So he's to be commended for the career he had. And if you just have kind of one crazy moment in your career, I don't think that's too bad,
Well, it's so... His popularity, he has certain things that he's done in his career that has reached, iconic level of popularity. But in reality, I think the real example of his achievement is the body
of work.
Because when you look at how large of the body of work that he was able to just continuously do without any dry periods, you know what I mean, where he really never had a time where he had a hard time looking for work.
In fact, I think Gar, he worked up until the end.
When you look at that body of work, it's massive.
Yeah, and Gar,
all the different cartoon characters that he did over the years, all of the years, the long stretch of the popularity of his radio show, the long stretch of popularity of America's Top 10, even the popularity of Shebang.
Sure. And Gar,
when you take all of that, it is an extremely large body of work.
Yeah, it is. And I should also mention that once America's Top 10 was pulled from TV, he went back to doing the Top 40 radio show for, I think, almost till he started to get sick in that, and then he was no longer doing that. But up until the time he got sick, he was doing the America's Top 40 radio show. So he went back to doing radio. He didn't try to get on he didn't try to get on MTV, or he didn't try to go and do something, get some other game show but I was surprised to find out, apparently, if you go on Casey Kasem's Wikipedia, there's a whole list of credits, not just for Scooby-Doo and stuff like that and voiceover work, but he took part in Mr. Magoo, animated TV show and stuff that I wasn't even aware of, and a lot of other movies and stuff from the 60s. So there's that stuff out there that people, if they want to go find it, they can find out about it.
Yeah, his body of work is huge.
Yeah.
And that's, that really is a big indicator. And when you're saying he went back to radio, it's because he has
that voice,
this perfect radio voice.
Sure.
That was his biggest element, was he just had that perfect for radio voice.
And in closing too, Gar, the thing that I would like to bring up is this guy got to start, doing voiceover work and on the radio, and so he had that magic golden radio voice, as you just said. But here's the thing: once America's Top 10 launched on TV, he went from being a radio DJ to having to kind of worry about his wardrobe. And when watching those old episodes, what's something that really stood out to you about his wardrobe?
Well, you were talking about it earlier, those funky sweaters.
Yeah.
But then you have to, when you look at it now,
that was the time.
That's how we describe it, those funky sweaters.
People know what we're talking about. Yeah.
It's when you look at it now, it's all out of perspective.
Sure.
Everything that was the reason why he was doing that is no longer relevant.
So
you look at it now, and all you do is you judge it on just your reaction from the here and the now. But you go back then, those sweaters were a thing. That was a popular thing that society was doing at that time, was going out and wearing those type of sweaters.
Even now, every year at Christmas, people,
I remember. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I had some of those sweaters back then.
Yeah. I was just going to say, every year, like at the Christmas office party, they have those, even to this day, I've experienced this myself, they have these ugly Christmas sweater contests, and people know what I'm talking about. But you're right, that back in the day when he was doing the show, people, if they were a Casey Kasem fan, that's what he's remembered for. One of the things that they'd be like, oh, well, Casey's going to wear a sweater like that, I think I'll go get one like that. And people very much would copy what their favorite celebrities would do. So that very much is a Casey Kasem thing, if you know what I mean.
It definitely was, I'm actually kind of grateful for the opportunity to actually explain that and put it in perspective.
Yes.
Because if you just see it now, you just go, look at that sweater, you know what I mean?
But I think he must have known.
There is a backstory to that.
I think he must have known something, because again, you watch these episodes, and not just the sweaters, but the background, the TV set was so, it looked like a radio, it looked like a jukebox. It was so, the colors were all so loud, but that's something that was also very popular in the 80s, those loud colors. And so, again, looking back at it as a kind of a visual time capsule, very interesting. I had fun watching the episodes, like, for the Billboard Chart from a week of May 2nd, whatever, 1983. It was fun to go back in time. It was a literally a visual time machine, and I think that's probably the only show that I've experienced like our very own time machine that does that.
Well, I think yes. If you really want to go in a real time machine,
America's Top 10.
Watch the old episodes of that.
Yeah.
Use our time machine to discover a new time machine.
And I think we'll close with this, Gar, and it makes a very good point in that, you've had like American Bandstand, they tried to get other people other than Dick Clark to host it. It didn't work. So
they even had Shadow Stevens for a while.
So I think it's very interesting that they never, once the show went off air, they never tried to bring it back with other popular DJs. They just, I think they're very smart just to keep it a Casey Kasem thing,
Yes.
Okay, Gar Borras, this was another fun episode, my friend. I just want to tell the folks, when we return in 2 weeks, we are going to start our holiday-themed shows, Halloween and stuff. And so the first one we're going to do this year is going to be Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, which I am really looking forward to.
You and me both there, brother.
Okay, Gar, buddy. You take care, my friend. Bye-bye.
Okay, take care, brother.
Chaotic Riffs Magazine.